My name is Melissa Hathaway, and I have the great honor to be able to moderate our first panel this morning. I have a couple of announcements. I'm not sure if they were made earlier, but I've been instructed to give them again. This session is on the record, and I would please be mindful of your telephones. If you'd put the ringers off or on silence, that would be most wonderful. And I'm going to first introduce our panelists here, and we have a great cross-sector of panelists coming from all over the world, and many of us are actually a little jet-lagged today. I have Mohammad Altura, who is the chief of the IT sector of the Communications and Information Technology Regulatory Authority. He is from Kuwait. And he's suffering from our cherry blossoms, I think, and all of the pollen in our air. So I'm very sorry, but it's a beautiful spring day. We have Mr. Hidetoshi Ogawa. He's the director for international strategy at the National Center for Incident Readiness and for Cybersecurity of Japan. He's in the Cabinet Secretary's office. We have His Excellence Karol Okoński. He's the Secretary of State, the Ministry of Digital Affairs in the Republic of Poland. And His Excellence Audrey Tang, and she's the Digital Minister from the Republic of China and Taiwan. And then finally, Mr. George Tyendezwa, I'm going to mix up all these, I'm sorry. And he's the Assistant Director and Head of Cybercrime Prosecution Unit at the Ministry of Justice in Nigeria, and he had a very early phone call from his boss this morning. And all of these people have all flown in the last day or so, except for Ms. Tang, who came in last week. And so with that, I'd like to just give a few opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to my panel. You know, the internet, and we are all here to talk about cybersecurity because the internet has really become the trusted backbone of our businesses, our critical infrastructures, and the global economy. And over the last several years, we have actually trusted the internet. But that 30 years of becoming critically dependent on the internet and those information communications technology, we've laced every part of our life with insecurity. The critical infrastructures and the technologies that underpin them are vulnerable, and they've been vulnerable since day one, and they continue to be vulnerable today. The challenges that we face are significant. We're continuing to embrace this information communications technology marketplace, and this year alone, the information communications technologies that we're going to embed in our businesses represent about a $3.8 trillion opportunity. And by 2020, just 1 year about away, we're going to have 30 billion internet-connected devices within our infrastructures through the Internet of Things, and they will represent about another $8 trillion opportunity within the digital economy. To put things into context, today's overall global economy is about $107 trillion. 26% is the digital base of it. And every day and every year, we're going to become more digitally focused. Our countries are racing to capture this digital economic opportunity. And our national champions and corporations are working fast to capture market share. Yet that economic opportunity is at risk because the underlying infrastructure is being attacked, and we're suffering from activism, crime, fraud, disruption of service, and destruction of property. Global internet crime alone is growing at a 25% year over year and is eroding the overall economic opportunity. We've allowed this ICT marketplace to deliver us flawed products with the principle of field it fast and fix it later. We know it as Patch Tuesday, which leads to Vulnerable Wednesday. Our businesses and governments worldwide are being impacted. And it's easy to find these unpatched systems on that Wednesday morning. You can go to the internet and using Shodan to find them. And then you could buy the tools quite easily, like a lemonade stand, $1 for a malicious software to corrupt a computer, $700 to disrupt and bring an overall business offline. Our national identities are for sale for just mere pennies. And we have to actually address this more responsibly. The average organization takes almost 9 months to figure out that they have a problem. And the reason that they know they have a problem is because Amy Hess and the FBI or the law enforcement institutions of your areas have come and knocked on your door and said, hey, we found your data someplace that it shouldn't be, your intellectual property, the personal identifiable information you were supposed to protect, etc. Once you know you have a problem, it normally takes you two months or more to actually start to investigate and figure out how bad is the situation. We've heard about some of these attacks, whether it's the WannaCry ransomware or the ransomware that took out the city of Atlanta, the NotPetya destructive attack that we attributed to Russia that was actually executed and destroyed businesses all around the world. Let me just give you one example that you may have read about. Maersk Shipping, that represents almost 20% of global commerce, shipping commerce, had its core infrastructure attacked through this NotPetya virus, and it destroyed 45,000 computers, 4,000 servers, 2,500 applications in less than 2 hours. Shipping around the world came to a halt. They lost 400 million euro in the first quarter. They lost 10% of their market share to the China Ocean Shipping Company. They lost 53% of the value of the company at the 18-month mark. Maersk Shipping won't recover from that destructive malware. And there were many other companies that were affected. Mondelez, who produces Oreo cookies, DLA Piper, a leading law firm, Merck Pharmaceuticals with the cancer-fighting drugs, and so on. These are just some of the victims of just one attack that had an economic impact of trillions of dollars. Our countries continue to actually talk about the threat in significant terms, and some of our countries have digital strategies, and some of our countries have cybersecurity strategies, and rarely are those strategies aligned. Our capitals need to reconcile the economic and national security agendas, because our cyber insecurity is a tax on growth. My panel and my panelists are going to talk about the digital and economic opportunities that their countries and the region are looking at. And they're going to talk about the cybersecurity and resilience approaches that are being brought to the market in their particular regions and in countries. We're going to talk about this competition and the struggle to balance these two initiatives in the region and in their countries and start to get to a dialogue of how we move forward. I'd like to now turn it over to my first panelist, which is going to be, I'm going to be a little informal and call everybody by their first names, will be Karol from Poland to give us a view from Europe and the new regulations in Europe, the strategies of Poland, how they're balancing the economic and national security going forward in that particular region. Karol, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I just have to check what will be the perfect distance here to speak the microphone. Okay, so thank you much for this introduction. Thank you much for being here. It is both my honor and pleasure to participate in such a event of such a scale, and with being one of the participants of this the list of distinguished other guests and speakers. So I think that the case of Poland and Europe is quite interesting. Might be quite interesting for all of you, because it is a case of countries like Poland being the member of European Union. So of actually the national and international European policy actually interlinking and mixing with each other all the time, and of actually certain states, members of the European Union, being ready actually to succumb their national, let's say, independence to some extent, to some mutual common rules that reign in the European Union, for the benefit in getting in return higher effectiveness and higher potential, and the scale of being ready to react to the threats that definitely now know no borders and can affect at the same time actually not only the whole regions, not to mention one country, but even have some effect on the whole world. That's why to much extent, most things that we do in Poland actually is either in the implementing or, let's say, in the way of reacting to either recommendations or the legal acts that are constituted at the level of or pass at the level of European Union. One thing, and one of the what we were actually doing last year, and most of the other European states at the same time, was the implementation of what we call the NIS Directive, a directive that meant to structure the way we should react to incidents in the way that will be able to maintain the business continuity of the whole country, selecting some key sectors of industry, and within these sectors, what we call the essential operators, and impose some additional regulations, additional requirements, and duties for those entities, to make sure that they report the incidents as fast as possible, and that they also proactively manage risk, assess the risk, and in the end that we can create a situation that the whole sector and the way the whole country can feel safer, especially as those sectors that were named in directive are the ones that really serve for are really the key, the most important ones for each country, being the health sector, energy sector, transportation, financial markets. And that's why, so this is something that is now in the course of implementation. We're selecting those entities, the institutions that will be named those essential operators. Now, there's also the notion that some incidents also require very smooth cooperation and exchange of information between the member states, again, as fast as possible to prepare some kind of a reaction to be adequate and stop the consequences of given attack. So now in Europe, each member state of the European Union has its point of contact for incidents handling, security incidents handling, and when you describe or report an incident, you should also describe the potential risk of given incidents also may be affecting another country, and this information is then passed quickly to all other states through this network of points of contact. Now, another two important legal acts at the level of Europe that are currently being processed at the level of European Parliament or being and will be implemented in the legal legislation of given country are the network of competence centers for cybersecurity. Now, this is an idea again that although some of European states can consider themselves as being large enough to perform their own research and development activities, also in case of cybersecurity, the European Union member states actually agreed, so the whole region agreed that it will make sense to control and to review all the efforts in terms of R&D for cybersecurity by building the network of and some structure, organizational structure for leading and running all the R&D work around cybersecurity, and again here trying to build some complementary competences between the states, so then as a whole Europe can increase its potential and also be able to produce some new products and the IP rights, so they can be distributed more accurately and more effectively across European Union, because as for the time being, actually, European Union is much more of an importer than an exporter of cybersecurity software and products. And the third legal act, I think it was worth mentioning here, is what we call the Cybersecurity Act. Here again, there were two parts of this legislation. In Europe, there is an agency, European agency called ENISA, that has also some leading role in terms of coordination, recommendation, and also an additional task in terms of certification that should be streamlined and coordinated between the states. And now, for the certification, an important factor is that the European states agreed that they want to have like pan-European, like common framework for certification. There will be added the new standards, the new framework, new profiles will be added to this, based more or less on what we have for common criteria for like SOGIs or CCRA. And here again, the main idea is that each country on its own will either not be able in terms of capacity or might not make sense in terms of economic profit to provide the necessary ability to be able to pass through the certification more and more products. And this is actually what, in terms of cybersecurity, both the public administration and all other key actors in the key sectors actually expect when they actually procure, when they make a tender for new products. They would pretty much expect to be able to put in the requirements some specific information that there should be the products that they want to acquire should have certain certificates, which would allow them both to, first of all, to be sure that the products that they buy are of the quality they expect, and secondly, to counter another problem that we face in Europe is the lack of necessary skills in terms of cybersecurity and both ICT specialists. When you can refer to some proven standard, it's just enough for the vendor actually to provide the information that he's compliant with the standard, and then some of the work on the side of the one that is acquiring these services is not necessary, which makes also the whole process more faster and more economically beneficial. So the idea is to have, like I said, the pan-European standards. We're in Poland also working on building our own certification body, first for common criteria, but it will be then the basis for this pan-European certification. Creating then in the end the capacity that would allow Europe to include in their systems the appliances and the software that fulfills some certain security requirements that we need. And what we're also doing now in Poland is that we're also working on our strategy, and so linking with what Lisa said at the very beginning. It is true that by wanting to take the best practice for what have been done so far in evaluation of our strategy, we of course also reviewed what other countries were doing, and it is true that every country is actually taking a bit different approach, mostly in the case of the level of detail, I would say, or the level of the time frame that strategy refers to. But I think it's still the situation, both the geopolitical, the background, the capacity, the capabilities of giving country are different. So I think the strategies will be different, but of course the best thing to do is still always base and learn from what have the others done, and this is the approach we take. So we pretty much want to take the best from all the other strategies, and also acknowledge the background that we have in Poland. So the intention is to have the new strategy passed by the end of this year. And the last thing I would just add, I mentioned before some legislative acts from European Union, but apart from this, we have also some recommendations. So this is not something that is, let's say, mandatory for European states, but also gives some guidelines. And recently, and something that also publicly also discussed throughout the world, there is the recommendation also in Europe to have some common approach to risk assessment for 5G implementation. And here Poland also be follow, let's say, the guidelines or the time guidelines. The plan is to have the recommendation, the risk assessment, and some actions based on this risk assessment by end of June. And the European Union wants to have some iteration of those, the information, the feedback will be provided, input will be provided from member states this fall. So here again, each country performs the analysis and will make the decision on its own. But there is an intention and will to try to check throughout this process between the member states in the region, in Europe, to see whether we have similar approach and whether the decisions will not be completely different between the member states. So we can still speak of what was the aspiration of the European Union of the digital single market that will not get fragmented because of the fact that given member state will just make completely different decisions. So all in all, just to the last word from my side at this introductory part, I think, and this was maybe also kind of an encouragement also for other regions, and I'll be also curious to learn and listen now what my colleagues will say. To some extent, the national security remained to be the standard and the discretion of each single state, single country. But now, in the face of the cybersecurity threats, I think we are, and we will see it in Europe, more and more willing to actually to succumb to some mutual agreements and framework that will be not national but international. And I think if we can do it at the regional level in Europe, I do expect and I do hope that we can also do it on more global level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karol. I think it's interesting that you have one thing driving in Europe from a digital single market and even some of the security and resilience of the core infrastructures, and then you have a different part of being driven from a NATO and a cyber defense of the countries, but each country as a sovereign level is actually determining its own fate, which is hard to harmonize a pan-European posture when each one is perhaps at a different path and of its maturity. I'm going to turn now over to Hidetoshi-san in Japan. And, Japan has had a long history of the internet. It's actually had one of the first connectivities in Asia in 1973. Coming through its university and has had a long set of strategies on cybersecurity and has digital strategies of Japan 2025 and the Internet of Things. And so I'm going to ask Hidetoshi-san to give us an overview of what's happening in Japan. They have the Olympics coming up. They've got World Cup and other things, right? World Rugby. And so Hidetoshi-san, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Just start.
Oh, yes. Hello. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor and privilege to be here at this very prestigious conference. Thank you very much. And I'd like to briefly introduce our Japanese cybersecurity strategy. The Japanese government has a sort of catch copy for describing a near future. This is named Society 5.0. That means after the Society 4.0, that is information society. But we think the coming new world, coming future world is not only a sort of evolution of information society, but we see a sort of disruption from now to the future. That is really information and the cyber sphere and the physical sphere is merging into one. That means the cyber-physical society will generate huge benefit or economic development or even human environment-friendly society. But as the two aspects joined together, the challenge in cybersecurity is furthermore serious than in the previous ages. In this cyber physical fusion society, we are now experimenting several projects in view of not only, but in mind of Tokyo Olympic Paralympic Games 2020. Our Prime Minister Abe has announced that in 2020, we'd like to see a sort of experimental phase of unmanned bus services in the site of Paralympic Games, as well as we are preparing to deploy also the experimental phase of 5G networks. It's not possible to deploy all over Japan by the end of 2020, but anyway, we'd like to see some services of 5G will be implemented in 2020. And the unmanned vehicles also. And for supporting such initiative, we have launched several artificial satellites to cover the Japan archipel in a more precise manner, which complements GPS satellite to have centimeter-grade precision for unmanned agricultural machines, or of course for vehicles which runs in public road, something like that. If we don't have a precise map, and if you don't have radio signals which really give us precise information, we cannot realize unmanned vehicles or machines. So this is a supporting element. With regard to the, against this background, with regard to our recent cybersecurity strategy, which is revised in 2018, we have three pillars of core notion, or core pillars. First one is socio-economic vitality and sustainable development, which sheds lights for the positive side of the IT development. And the second pillar is safety and security for the people. That is reflecting the a bit negative side of the IT development, which is linked to cybersecurity. And the third pillar is peace and stability of the nation and the whole world. That that represents the necessity of international cooperation. We have not only in Japan, but also we have several important international multilateral settings in the APEC, like the APEC Telecommunication and Information Working Group, which has worked since more than 20 years. And in ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum is another very important political framework, which comprises not only like-minded countries, but also, as a diplomat, ex-diplomat, I don't want to name the unlike-minded countries, but you can imagine big neighbors. That forum is comprising such actors. So we think that it's important to have active sharing of information with like-minded countries, but we think that it's not good to give up the effort to reach out to such countries to reduce the gap of notions, not to attack to your critical infrastructures, violating international existing laws, something like that. I'd like to just introduce two initiatives that Japan has recently engaged. First one is the public-private cooperation aspect. In Japan also, it's a sort of international common challenges, but we see that there is much to be done in efforts of public-private cooperation in terms of cybersecurity. Because in private sector, we see sometimes a sort of reticence, a sort of reservation for sharing their incident-related information for fear of their reputation risk or for fear of violating privacy-related personal identifiable information of their customers. So the Japanese government has revised the Cybersecurity Act at the end of last year to create a Cybersecurity Council, which is just enacted first day of this month. In this conference, the law stipulates the need of information sharing between trusted members of this council. This is a sort of, I cannot say mandatory, but the law expects that the members share their incident information. It's a sort of a requirement by law, even though the decision of whether to give such information is still voluntary, still decided by members, by each members. But anyway, this is clearly asked, expected by the law to share such information. So we see, we hope that the information sharing between private members of the council and private member and the public members will have such information sharing besides the existing fora like ISAC of each sectors. This Cybersecurity Council is a sort of cross-cutting domain information sharing forum. So now this is on the top of existing fora. We expect to accelerate public-private cooperation by this law. And this law also have a punishment clause if a member will breach the obligation of the protection of information in inadequate manner. And the last point is, as Karol-san explained, in Japan also we see a huge lack of cybersecurity specialists in near future. In 2020, we estimate that around 200,000 cybersecurity specialists are lacking in Japan. Actually, we have already lack of the human resources in cybersecurity, but as the society evolves, this gap will unfortunately grow toward 200,000 cybersecurity specialists. So if there are people, especially in cybersecurity, please consider to come to Japan to help cybersecurity protection. Thank you very much.
There's lots of job opportunity in Japan. So for the 100 students that have registered here, there's lots of opportunities, I think, in each one of our countries to meet the skill gap, which I think transcends not just technically, it's from a political policy level, legal level, et cetera.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it now to Minister Tang. Audrey and I had the opportunity to speak back-to-back in Toronto just a few months ago, and she talked about the digitization efforts that are happening in Taiwan and really kind of actually bringing the technology to the kids, and she also talked about what's going on in the region. So, Audrey, I'm looking forward to hearing this again because I think there's so much we can learn from you. So the floor is yours.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, very happy to be here to share with you Taiwan's digital strategy, of which cybersecurity is part of it. But I think our digital strategy is literally spelled DIGI plus. It's called DigiPlus, and where the DIGI stands for Development, Innovation, Governance, and Inclusion, respectively. And for development in Taiwan, broadband is a human right. Anywhere in Taiwan if you don't have 10 megabits per second, it's personally my fault. And because of that, even in very remote islands. and so we really take care that when we're doing development, it doesn't widen the digital gap, that there is the digital literacy element in it, and that I'm a radically transparent minister. And so during the reception last night, many people asked me how large is my ministry. Truth to be told, I have no ministry. In Taiwan, there is 32 ministries, each with a vertical minister, but above the 32 ministries, there are 9 horizontal ministers, and I'm one of the 9, and each of us have a different mandate, and my office, about 22 staff, is literally one person poached from each ministry. And so this is a very cross-cutting, horizontal kind of quote-unquote leadership, and what we're seeing is that digital strategy really is not any particular ministry's business. It has to be entirely cross-cutting, and because of that, it's the same in our cybersecurity department. It's not within any ministry, it's within the executive yuan or the administration itself. And so our main focus in the development of our cybersecurity strategy is to engage in as many information sharing and rapid response system that we can participate as possible. Of course, that includes the usual cert systems, the AP cert, US cert, including the automated indicator sharing, including, of course, bringing what we can publicly say to the international internet governance forums and so on. And so that, of course, is a large part of it. But lately, what we've been focusing is not actually only on the cybersecurity level, but also on the governance level as well, which I'm particularly interested in as I'm the minister also in charge of open government. So in each of our ministries, there's an extended team of my office called the participation officers, and they're essentially in charge of looking at our e-petition website, any of our summoning. I like it to say summoning because anyone can collect 5,000 signatures and summon me to your door, or engage in any, my office hours, which is every Wednesday, and just come to my office and have 40 minutes of my time. And so as long as you agree to publish the entirely transparent record online, people can build up on each other's conversations and basically give a context of the why of policymaking instead of just a what of policymaking. And in that, we collaborate with a lot of regional platforms that spread this kind of multi-stakeholderism, not just in the context of internet governance or cyber governance, but actually merging it back into the government itself. And I have in mind, of course, the civic tech networks, the Code for All network. Regionally, we had a lot of collaboration with the Code for Japan network, which advocates this kind of innovative governance in the settings. We're going to hold hackathons together with also the Korean counterpart as well, and all with an eye of using cyber engagement to further democracy. And just last week, we launched a digital dialogue. If you Google for digital AIT, I think AIT stands for America in Taiwan, you can see an AI-powered conversation that asked everybody, what do you think should be the agenda of the future US-Taiwan collaboration? And it's an AI-powered conversation that is troll-free by design. This is usually a very divisive topic. But if you get into the interface of our digital dialogue, you can see other people's statement. You can click whether you resonate or not with their statement, and it shows a beautiful picture of how people, gets different factions in their social media friends and things like that. But the beauty is that there is no reply button, and so because of that, there's no way to make personal attacks. If you just see some statement you don't agree with, the best recourse is propose something else for other people to resonate or not with. And at the end of each 2 months consultation period, the AIT in Taiwan is committed to have a real forum that incorporates the most resonating ideas into our diplomatic agenda. So this is what we call crowdsourced agenda setting, and it has been pretty well endorsed and spread in the region, and we held workshops, for example, in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, certainly, but also in Toronto, in the US, Madrid, London, you name it, to basically spread this kind of crowdsourced policy making. And I think this is particularly important in the new challenges that Taiwan is facing. We're facing, of course, the disinformation crisis, where foreign power try to hijack elections through various other disinformation ways. And unlike some of our neighbors who use this as kind of an excuse to extend state power, we hold ourselves to account to first never infringe on freedom of speech, but most importantly, we get the platforms in a public way, publicly live streamed, crowdsourcing their agenda and so on, and basically figure out our common values despite our different positions going forward. And so now we're settling on what we call a notice and public notice method that has been deployed in a regional non-Taiwanese end-to-end encrypted platform called Line, which is pretty large regionally, and they do agree to implement first in Taiwan this notice and public notice system to fight against disinformation. And so I think this is one of the cases where we legalize through laws that we can bring multi-stakeholder consultations, the internet governance methodologies back into the legal system itself. And finally, just to bring one of the more recent projects, which literally just launched yesterday, is called Presidential Hackathon. And you hear hackathon, maybe you think of a 2-day or 3-day event, but our Presidential Hackathon is annual and it runs for 3 months every year. Every year, there's like hundreds of cases that's proposed by international and also domestic counterparts of how to further our President Dr. Tsai's agenda. And usually we coach them to form what we call trilingual data collaboratives. That is to say, a team existing at least with 3 people. One is the domain expert, and one is the data or tech expert, and one is the regulatory expert or data owner. And together we form those data stewards into data collaboratives that every year we select 5 teams at the end, and there's no award prize money. The award is literally a trophy that serves as a projector that projects the President Dr. Tsai handing the trophy to the team, and is very important because it signifies a presidential promise that all the 5 teams that wins every year, we commit to make their idea into our administration policy with all the regulatory and budget commitments by the end of next year, so in the next 9 months. And so this is a pretty good way to get social innovators really into the policy-making place. And our deliveries, for example, last year we used machine learning to look at our Taiwan IoT network that measures the water flow and pressure of our public water providers, the Taiwan Water Corporation, and really reduced the detection of water leakage dramatically through an interactive AI-based system. And because all of this is public, New Zealand took notice and say, hey, this is one of the SDGs, right, climate change action. And they didn't used to have a water shortage problem, but now they're beginning to. So they just invited our trilingual team to Wellington for another 3 months for co-creation. It shows enormous trust, of course, when you're willing to hand your SCADA data to a foreign team. But the way that we do the co-creation using only open source software and so on really earns this trust regionally, and we're looking forward to more collaboration like that in this year's Presidential Hackathon, which the voting just started yesterday, and we use quadratic voting, which is a new voting system invented by the Ethereum people. And so that's my brief so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. I'm really struck by the innovation. I think it's, if you listened to Minister Ko, David earlier said it's, the advantage of being small is you have these great test beds, and then the transparency and bringing everybody in of the crowdsource policy or the crowdsourcing of the technology is quite interesting. And I think there's much that we can learn from each of your different countries. I'm going to now turn to George, who's going to talk to us about some of the innovation happening in Nigeria. As many of you know, Africa has leapfrogged us and how they use mobile services and their connectivity, and Nigeria being one of the leading countries in the region broadly of talking through these things. So George, now the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Hello. Good day. It's great to be here to share some of what we're doing with you and also to learn from this August gathering. Basically, now, for Nigeria, recognizing, of course, the importance that engagement within the cyberspace plays is a major theme. And so a couple of years back, we started the journey, began focusing a lot of attention towards this area. Now, we started with the basics. We needed to deal with cybercrime. So we started from that point and then developed a national cybersecurity strategy, and which ironically is up for review by this year. So it was the first iteration of the strategy was in 2014. That's when it was formally adopted, but surprisingly, it's, time runs, so it is up for review at this time. And what is important to share with you is that within that time, from that first strategy that we did, and now, there are quite a number of things that we've learned we needed to have done differently. There are quite a number of things that we also didn't put in proper perspective. But having said that, we also recognized that we have a number of national priorities that our strategy addresses. Basically, we focused on what is relevant in helping us build cyber resilience. We also focused on building coalitions for coordination. This was important because we needed to coordinate internally, interagency, intergovernment, and all. It was something that wasn't there before, so we built that as one of the key requirements. Just like the example from Japan, we're concerned about incident response and recovery. And we've made, under the law, reporting is a mandatory thing. It's a requirement of the law. However, we're trying to also work out a situation where reporting is not done because you want to comply with the law, but because you have that trust. So we're building trusted information sharing networks. And so far, across sectors, one of the most targeted areas of our economy actually is the financial sector. So we first of all focused around this area, and I can say that we put in place a multi-stakeholder initiative called the Nigerian Electronic Fraud Forum. From 2012, when it became operational up to last year, I can actually say that we actually saw a remarkable drop in the level of losses being suffered by financial institutions, because prior to this time, what was happening was you would have the same kind of attacks run through the different players, different banks, because people weren't sharing information. But when this worked, what basically happened is, while the level of attempts at fraud continue to increase, the level of losses is actually on the decrease. Now, we've also realized the importance of building a public-private partnership approach to this tackling cyber threats. Now, this is born out of the fact that, like in several nations, most of the infrastructure is in private hands. So we needed to, and have worked, we continue to work on increasing the level of trust, the level of voluntary cooperation that we can have with service providers, infrastructure owners. The other thing is, just again, this is a recurring thing because we have issues around building, having the skilled manpower to do the things that we need. So cyber capacity building, not just for investigators or not just to deal with crime or incidents, but also to develop that manpower that is required, both from a policy side as well as operational side. So one of the focuses, one of our national priorities is redesigning our educational curriculum to ensure that we begin to build citizens that will have that capacity to not just respond to incidents, but also work hard to prevent future threats. The other thing, too, that we've focused on as a nation is building a culture of cyber hygiene. Now, this is very key. So we've prioritized public enlightenment, creating awareness, particularly amongst very vulnerable groups and all of that. So basically, this is in summary some of the key priorities that we're pursuing in this area. But also, we've recognized the importance of collaborating across with partners, both internally and externally. So international cooperation plays a key role in some of what, both in building capacity, in exchanging operational information, as well as checking that we actually are achieving some of the goals that we've set down. Now, like I indicated, yes, we're going to be reviewing our national cybersecurity strategy. Part of that review process, and also part of that review process actually led us to realize that we needed to do not just a whole of government approach to addressing cyber, but we needed to actually build a whole of society. So the work on the review is actually going to help us focus more on ensuring that we are not just looking at a whole of government approach to cybersecurity, but rather a whole of society approach to cybersecurity. Now, in this regard, we're not just doing some of this within Nigeria alone, but on the sub-regional level, at the level of the Economic Community of West African States, Nigeria is actively engaging in helping to coordinate efforts around also creating awareness, creating the culture of cybersecurity within the region. We've also are also actively engaged with some of the work that the African Union is also seeking to do in this area. So I would say that by way of opening, I think these are just some of the preliminary things that we're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. You can see that each of our different countries are in a different stage of the maturity curve, some being more swept in from regional policies and others from incubating from at a national level. And I'm going to turn to Mohammad to give us a perspective from Kuwait. As you know, the Gulf region is actually suffering from a number of industrial control system attacks going against the oil and gas infrastructure as well as the chemical plants, of which I think Joe Weiss will talk about on one of our panels today. And this region is suffering maybe more than any of the destructive attacks. And so it's making the policies so kind of laser focused on the need for security and resilience in the region. So Mohammad, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good day. I'm so glad to be here, and I'd like to thank Atlantic Council for giving us the opportunity to participate today. Well, I hope I don't lose my voice in the middle of this great discussion. Kuwait has released its national cybersecurity strategy December 2017, given the fact that we see a big threat to our critical national infrastructure, such as oil, petrochemical, and it's very similar to the rest of the region as well. As you know, when you have a geopolitics unrest, you are very vulnerable to those attacks, and we have to become resilient in order for us to save our economy. So I am from CITRA. CITRA is a telecom and IT regulator in Kuwait. And the main goal for any regulator is to make sure we regulate the technology and the telecom to result three simple things. And those three simple things are making people's life easier, develop and secure the economy, and support innovation. That's the bottom line. Now, in order for us to do that, we have to do a lot. We have to make sure that we are using technology every day in our lives, and it's become a DNA of our economy. And as you see that now, the digital transformation world is becoming very popular among many countries. In the GCC itself, Kingdom of Bahrain has started already released that policy on the national scale, and Kuwait also announced it on the 28th of March, which was my birthday, that we are on this journey. And why are we doing digital transformation? Because it's a trend where it's going to include the new technologies that's going to be very important to make our government agency much efficient, much cost-effective, predictable in terms of budget, and very much efficient in terms of services to the citizens and people who are living in Kuwait. So does the commercial sector. The commercial sector becomes more competitive when they go for digital transformation, opens a new technology such as AI and blockchain, and also the IoT that's coming up soon in Kuwait. Kuwait has one of the most robust 4G coverage geographically. Yes, it's a small country, of course, but that's boosting our inclusion in terms of internet access with people, and the number of smartphone penetration, the subscription of LTE is one of the highest in the world. Therefore, we have to make sure that we are resilient. We have to make sure we make a balance between cybersecurity restrictions and policies and the new trends that's coming out there. So if you think about how would we make that balance, I would definitely make sure that innovation cannot be blocked by any challenge of cyber. So we always going to have to support innovation, and we have to also accommodate cyber to it. And most of all now, you have seen the whole industry shifting, and the cyber becomes much easier to deal with when you have a digital transformation strategy. And the reason why, because as Gartner quoted, in 2020, 60% less attacks if you are infrastructure using the cloud. Cloud is based on NIST standard that is going to be very secure and robust, much more than most of the on-prem infrastructures. And as you know, when you have, there are two highways, to be honest with you. There is an IT classical highway, and there is a digital transformation highway, and they're going to be intersect where digital transformation will be bigger. The classical highway is costly these days, unpredictable budgets, and it keeps adding devices and hardware and racks and devices that you have to worry about, which cause most of the IT department's headache rather than focusing on their core business. So this model has been shifted, whereby we like to make sure that we are utilizing a robust infrastructure, and it doesn't have to be on our premise. Along with that, we come in with a very simple data classification to make sure that people understand what data they can put it on public clouds, what data they can still put it on public clouds, and make sure they have secure controls and encryptions. And of course, there is a sovereignty data that I would agree that most country has to keep it on premise. So in the cybersecurity game is changing. Cybersecurity with the digital transformation is becoming part of the service DNA, makes easier for people and much cheaper to sustain in terms of secured environment. If we think about the opportunity to the economy, most economies in the world, all the economies of the world are now depending on the entrepreneur business in terms of development. So you cannot develop economy without a strong base of entrepreneurs. And with the new trends, entrepreneurs are in the hottest seats. They are the ones who's going to grab this opportunity and grow it and make such a good innovation. When we talk about AI and blockchain and IoT, this smart cities, this is an entrepreneur opportunity, and that would definitely stimulate any economy in the world and boost its innovation. So for job creation, cybersecurity is always going to help more of job creation, because with these trends becoming very diversified, cybersecurity is becoming the same thing. And that will help us to create jobs in our economies. And for those countries who have economical tides, it's very important that they do a very simple mechanism for information sharing. Because if countries share information, they become stronger. They make it even more difficult for the attackers. And if you go to the global risk report, it's changing. There are 29 risks every country should look at, and those risks varies from country to country, such as water crisis, such as political unrest, such as the environmental disasters or man-made environmental disasters. And now you will see cybersecurity attacks is taking a high scale in that among those risks that you see in this report. And the critical infrastructure breakdown due to cyber attacks is also becoming a very high risk to the economy. The data fraud as well is becoming very usual these days, that you can see people are losing their customer records, credit cards, insurance, what have you. And last but not least, if your country has advancement of technological advancement, that's also a problem. So if you don't advance in your technology, you will have an economical risk, because you will limit job allocation, you would have uncontrolled cost, and you cannot compete on the world, on the global world when it comes to your commercial sector. So having said all of that, we all in Kuwait think that technology is going to be the center of our economy. Now I get to find some businesses, when they do organization restructure, they think about technology first, how technology can help us before we restructure our business. Things are changing very fast in that regard. And that also helps companies to return more cash, to have more control on their spendings, and also reduce the cost across the board, not only the IT cost. When you do the transformation, you reduce the OPEX of all departments and sectors that you have in your business or your organization. And of course, reduce the cost of new opportunities. So if you have a new opportunity you want to jump in and wanted to make it in action, then with the digital transformation will make it much cost-effective to jump into this opportunity. And according to Gartner quote, that 60%, which I repeat myself, of your infrastructure cost will be reduced, so that the attacks. Also, there is another quote by CIA CEO, which says, I'm never going to say anything you do in the cyber world is totally invisible. This is when it comes to digital transformation. So even CIA are adapting to this journey. I believe this is a journey that doesn't solve the problems overnight, but we have to make sure that we make our first cloud policy is in action, because policies without doing something on the ground is just a paperwork. So this policy is very serious in terms of our ecosystem, our politicians, our government leaders. They're all in sync and really supporting this moving forward in our country. Smart cities is also a new trend that we are seeing. Back home in my country, every smart city has to basically become resilient by nature. And when you think about smart city, you think about utilities, you think about water supply, you think about municipality, you think about public safety, you think about traffic. Oh, the traffic is becoming a headache to a lot of countries now, and it's a world problem actually. So having the cybersecurity with all these new trends, it is very important that the country should make sure that the strategy is very open, very flexible, supports new trends, and very simple to understand to anyone. This is all I have to say, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mohammad. I'm going to invite the audience for questions. I have one question while you queue up into the, I think that was really interesting when you talk about, the technology avoidance creates the economic risk, and this is why all of our countries are embracing this digital transformation. I had the opportunity to sit down with the CEO of one of the leading insurance companies in this area, and he talked about the correlated risk. As we start to connect the people, places, and things and add 30 billion devices to the internet over the next year or so and connect more and more of our cities, we're creating a correlated risk that I only need to get into one place to bring down much more of the overall infrastructure and architecture. Our city in Atlanta is one of our top connected cities. One might call it smart, but it was brought down by a SamSam ransomware, which means it's quite dumb. So we have to start to think through the resilience scenarios of each of our countries and within the region, because one country could bring down more infrastructures and critical services in other countries and sovereign states. So my question to you is when you think about this digital transformation, and Mohammad, you talked a little bit about it, you have to build the resilience in. But are we really thinking through the crisis scenario of what happens when Maersk shipping, that represents 7% of Denmark's GDP, goes offline? Or when a major port like San Diego or the Port of Rotterdam is brought down from the NotPetya malicious software? I'd like each of my panelists to talk about what is the #1 crisis scenario that you're most worried about in this area, and then what are the resilience efforts that you're undertaking to address and manage that risk. And then again, to the audience, please queue for your questions. Thank you. Who would like? Mohammad, you start.
Every country should understand what are the critical services that's directly affecting the economy, whether it's a shipment or oil and gas or manufacturing. You have to define your critical national services. And there are many models for digital transformation. There are models that's hybrid. So in case you lose the service of the internet, you still can get things going. For example, in the healthcare, you want to make sure that the health records are always on, no matter what. So you still can do different digital transformation implementation models. There is a model that's purely public cloud. There is a model that's hybrid. There is a model that can be on-prem. But having said that, we have to define those critical services and make sure they're 24/7, even if you don't have internet, even if you get hit by national disaster that's going to knock you offline. So that's much cheaper than going the classical way, of course, because with the classical way, you always have to put so much systems, so much hardware, so much operations. With the digital transformation is much easier because there's so much workloads going between public and private cloud that's going to allow you to reduce the cost. So, and most of them are not going to be used 24/7 because some services only used during working hours. Some services are used maybe on 5 days or a few days a week. So you have to define your critical services in your country and make sure it's 24/7 using digital transformation with a cyber in the DNA, because in the old days, we make the solution and then we cyber the solution. Now we have an opportunity to build the solution with cyber by DNA. AI will help us to do that. AI will see many weird behaviors that can happen over your network and take a decision by itself. So this is a great opportunity and advantage for such countries to use these new technologies to become more resilient.
Thank you. Hidetoshi-san, I was in Japan just recently, and there was you have just demonstrated 5G on the high-speed trains from Tokyo to Kyoto, and you're embracing the Internet of Things quite in an extraordinary way. But I also note that the attack surface of the Internet of Things is actually increased by more than 600% this past year. So when you think about the one crisis scenario for Japan and building the resilience in, what would that be?
Thank you very much. With regard to the crisis scenario, the number one is, as Mohammad mentioned, the crisis which covers physical area and cyber area at the same time. That means with the cyber attack or with cyber malfunctions, if it hampers our critical infrastructure, this is the most devastating physical damage to the society. And so to be prepared for such a cyber-physical fusion crisis, the Japanese government is conducting annual periodical exercise, cross-sectoral exercise, public, private, and many critical infrastructure operators with participation from local governments. They are conducting crisis preparedness exercise. And we have the last one last December, and to which more than 2,000 people, 3,000 people attended. And another one is a bit invisible crisis. This is the possible theft of intellectual property or the sensitive information, such as private sensitive information like medical records, etc., through vulnerability hole of networks or information systems. And with regard to the public information systems, we have just, as Melissa-san mentioned, we have just made an interagency agreement at the cabinet level not to purchase vulnerable information systems if it is less costly if it is cheaper, we should purchase more secure information systems or network services with regard to the supply chain risk. And this policy is applied also to the development of 5G networks. 5G networks is not government information systems, but this will cover all over the society, including the public sector. So now the government has announced that the 5G suppliers should pay more attention to the supply chain risk when they will deploy their services.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Karol, Poland sits on the eastern flank of NATO and also leading the digital 3Cs initiative of trying to create the north-south corridors from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Can you talk a little bit about what is the crisis scenario where it keeps you up at night?
Right. So, like was said here before, I think anything, with the notion to promoting digital transformation, of course, with any increase of going digital, makes also the exposure to the potential risks also higher. So this is obvious, and so whenever we digital is something, we have to make sure that we provide the necessary backup solution, or we have some disaster recovery center, and like going to cloud solutions may be also, of course, one of the possibilities here to prevent the risk. And in terms of the scenarios and aspects that are most important for us, I think I would not be here I would not say anything new as I think the sheer list of in critical infrastructure. With also combined with the more and more involvement of ICT systems in the how they operate, of course, makes any of those objects and all those operators also to a great extent of the risk of continuing how the country works. The same applies to what I have mentioned before, the key sectors of industry, so being it health, financial services, energy, transportation, so on. Also, what we also see at the level of European Union, and what we also actually put more attention to is what we call the digital service providers, because actually their area of activities, like be it the search engines, the internet search engines, or cloud services providers, or digital marketplaces, actually they all operate at such a large scale, and being actually usually the global players, that here again we in European Union we also want to make sure that whenever there's some accident above certain threshold, that this is gets reported as soon as possible, so that the citizens in each of the country get necessary information how they should react and to what extent their data is, for example, at risk. Speaking of data, of course, there's the topic of data privacy, and specifically in Europe, the GDPR. Again, here, by the fact that we have introduced some specific measures and requirements for the entities to process the personal data, it also added some additional requirements for their IT systems. So this is again like an important topic. You mentioned the potential, being the eastern frontier of European Union, makes us, and we also see and experience it also, the potential victims of some of the attacks of disinformation, like from Russia and from elsewhere. So in the before we'll have the elections to the European Parliament within one month in Europe, so all European member states will have their elections to their members of the European Parliament. This is again one of the elections that's coordinated by European Union. There is the There's what we call the European Election Network established, that again, the points of contact that make sure that the information is distributed at fast pace, and then the reaction also coordinated. And we have what we call also the rapid action system from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that whenever, again, like an attack or anything similar happens, that there is some common action to this. And at the same time, we have also, and this is, I think, one of the way also to make sure that we are more and more resilient to such potential attacks. There is some common also exercises performed by not only within one country, but also between the countries. So there was, for example, 2 weeks ago, there's one common tabletop exercise in Europe for the elections, for some scenarios that were actually to see whether the current procedures really work correctly. There's also some other exercises planned then also that simulate the real attacks. And then again here there's some coordination and how the NIRS directive for the coordination of incidents handling work in Europe is also in plan. So I think the important thing is to act, I would say, on 3 levels. So first of all, I would say, and those will be the least mature, I would say, would be the reaction to the incident. So here to make sure that the information is passed as soon as possible, and here that we have at least the point of contacts in given country, so we can, who will know to who to pass the information, and who can then pass it over. Now there's the proactive approach of making sure that we have the correct risk assessment, and here the cyber threat intelligence and the partnership here, and also the partnership between the private and public sector, so that we know in advance what and can dynamically adapt our risk assessment in the face of the new challenges that happen and that appear. That would be the second level, and the third level probably underestimated, but I think it's trying to tackle, let's say, the source and origins of the attack. So actually, why people actually attack, why people the criminals or third countries actually engage in such actions. I think here, acting globally in terms of bringing some proper values and well-being to the countries. Can also have its dramatic impact, because it's knowing that there is the high risk of getting caught, or that there will be some concrete consequences of an attack, be it the sanctions or the prosecution, the effective prosecution, and the fact that the willingness to perform the attack is definitely lower if you consider yourself genuinely happy in terms of how your situation, your country is going on. So I think here the common efforts between the countries to basically have the distribution of wealth and the digital inclusion and building awareness between the citizens is definitely something that we should also put our efforts on.
Thank you. Audrey and Georgia, I want you to answer this question also, but one of my colleagues has been standing there for almost 15 minutes, and I'd like him to be able to ask the question, and maybe we can dovetail his question and answers into your remaining answers. Please.
My question's a more specific version of your question, so thank you. This is mostly for Minister Tang, but anyone else can take it as well. My name is Mike Nelson. I work on policy for emerging technologies, so I was very glad to hear blockchain mentioned. And my question is, how can governments promote the use of blockchain when the biggest use of blockchain that everybody hears about is Bitcoin, which has been shown to be problematic and the source of lots of cyber attacks? So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but we have a perception problem. So that would be my question.
So Audrey, could you talk to blockchain and then also perhaps the scenario that keeps you up at night?
Okay. Well, the civil IoT system in Taiwan is powered by distributed ledger technology. I use the term DLT. Feel free to keep saying blockchain. I think distributed ledgers is a more neutral term to describe this kind of accountability keeping technology. Taiwan, you may have heard about, is the like for 2 years running the world's top country on open data. And very interestingly, in Taiwan, when we say open data, we don't just mean open government data. It's actually often open citizen data. For example, in air quality, in water quality, and so on, there's many microsensors, like thousands of them, tens of thousands now, being run by citizen scientists that gives a clear picture of where the air and water qualities are at any given moment. It's very rare in our region because it directly challenges the legitimacy of our environmental protection authority, as you might imagine. If a EPA has a number and your friends or neighbor have a different number, of course, people trust their neighbor's number. But of course, instead of, because we're radically democratic and free, instead of, we can't beat them, so we join them. And so we allocate a large amount of funding that's in addition to the guaranteed 5 to 7% of all government funding that goes to cybersecurity into securing the reliable or trustworthiness of the civil IoT numbers. And we do that through distributed ledger technology. We work with Academia Sinica, which is a research institute that report directly to the president and all the cabinet to make sure that all the incoming data from the citizens are snapshotted, stored on distributed ledgers, spread to all the different places, and kept a copy at our National High-Speed Computing Center so that people can submit their models that works on exactly the same data. And this is what we call open algorithm model, as advocated by Sandy and friends from MIT. And so I think this model really enables new collaborative, what we call data collaboratives here, because then everybody can trust each other to non-mutate each other's data, even if it's of a high variety and velocity. There's many other uses of distributed ledger that we use, for example, to guarantee that crowdfunded, foreign aid and so on goes to the right hand by, serving as a kind of parallel track to auditing. There's people deploying that to campaign financing, and we're very quickly passing the honest advertisement ad, and that will actually compare the what we call candidates' pre-release numbers versus the actual numbers from the auditing agency and so on. So we largely use it as a trust machine, and I think that's its current mature application. There's, of course, a lot of not so mature applications. Now, back to your question. I think the main scenario that I'm worried about is the wholesale breakdown or takedown. Sometimes they appear together of our energy and telecommunications grid, and that's because Taiwan is a really small island. It's just some 400 km or 250 miles long. So the island is literally grown out of the tectonic plates some 4 million years ago, and we're still growing 5 centimeters every year. And that means that there's lots of earthquakes, and there's a lot of historically large power outages as well as telecommunication outages that born out of earthquake and typhoons. And so we, of course, run a lot of drills, but nature runs drills for us many times a year, and that's the resiliency scenario. And of course, recently, now that the PLA has, military planes making incursions over the middle of the Taiwan Strait, that is coupled with the regular potential of them taking over the energy and telecommunications grid as well. And that we have also put a lot of relationship with our white hat hacker community. When I became digital minister 2.5 years ago, I bring with myself a cybersecurity system for government agencies, and I personally invited the top white hat hackers like Second Place and DEF CON and so on to attack that for 6 months and filed some 3 CVEs. And I think that really signified that to be a white hat hacker in Taiwan, you get paid really well, like 5% to 7% of all government project. You get to meet with president and or the digital minister every once in a while, and that will make sure that they're really well treated so they don't fall to the dark side, which always has more cookies.
Thank you, Audrey. George, in West Africa, I would imagine that the connectivity or the resilience of that telecommunications is similar. Is that what is the scenario, the one crisis scenario that keeps you up at night?
I think basically our main concern is around the financial sector and then utilities. So, you've mentioned it, the telecommunications, because when people can't talk to each other, there is the direct impact on lives is, you can imagine what it is. So when you have a shutdown of just even the telecommunications, you have challenges around misinformation, fear, because a lot of people have come to rely on telecommunications, even for sending, for financial transactions. There's a lot of mobile applications being used in Nigeria, so that's one of the key things. Of course, the other issue that is a matter of concern is, and I mentioned this even with the collaboration within the financial sector, you find that there's been a lot of targeted attacks at the banking system within the country. One major challenge we have, of course, is that of attribution. So yes, you're able to detect something is happening and all of that, but having the capability to actually drill down and roll back to know who is responsible for this. Of course, a lot of it is across your borders, and that is why international collaboration is very important. But that capability to work out attribution is a very key component, especially as when you relate it to the kind of targeted attacks, particularly on our financial sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that as we're coming to a close of this panel of regional perspectives on cyber, I hope you, the audience, were able to kind of do a tour de table from Japan to Nigeria to Taiwan to Kuwait and Poland and Europe. I think that you can see that there's so many different lenses on cybersecurity and what keeps our leaders up at night, and how important it is to align our economic appetite with the need to ensuring that it's underpinned by security and resilience. So please help me thank my panelists for their contributions this morning.